Chapter 1 of Folk Tales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Folk Tales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 1 The Story of the 10 Sources, a Legend of Hungary. In the wild Carpathians, where the everlasting hills lift their peaks far into the serene blue of heaven, a torrent known as the River of the 10 Sources rushes with eager fury down the steep slopes of the mountain walls, rising in wild disorder on every side. Even the perpetual thunder of its fall is soon swallowed up in the mightier silence which broods upon the scene, and save for the roar of some beast of prey, the profound stillness is rarely broken, even by the echo of the hunter's tally-ho. In this remote spot the mountains Bük and Matra join hands together, and through the dense forests which cling to their shoulders and clothe their naked limbs, the cataract pursues its way to the abyss whose rocky jaws gape wide to receive it. High on the cliffs above, the passage of the torrent may be traced by clouds of spray and arches of glowing colors where the sunbeams play amidst the vapor tossed up by the impetuous stream, and farther up may be seen 3 faint reeds, like gossamer garments of the mountain elves, which mark the spots where 3 hot springs mingle with the icy stream from 7 other sources near by. Long, long ago, this wild and romantic scene was peopled by the fairies, and on a day there came 10 young hunters, who had pressed far beyond the haunts of their kind on the tracks of bears, boars, bison, and other wild beasts which roamed the deep recesses of the woods. 10 bold and adventurous brothers they were, and merrily did they wind their horns, and blithely did they sing the deeds of brave warriors and bold huntsmen as they forced their way through the forest wilds. Suddenly they came to a glimpse of the open sky, and they saw a sight which stilled their songs and riveted their feet to the ground. Towering above the giant firs were 2 mountain peaks flushed with the rays of the noonday sun. But fairer than the deep blue of the sky, fairer than the rosy hues of the mountain peaks, were the forms of a host of fairies, the most beautiful that mortal eyes had ever looked upon. They were standing on the peaks, tossing diamond balls from one to the other across the deep chasm, and as the sun shone upon the balls, it seemed to the brothers that they had never seen rainbow so beautiful as this glittering arch which spanned the abyss. As they stood open-mouthed with delight, they beheld an even more wonderful sight, for suddenly a fairy seated herself upon one of the balls, and flew like the wind to the opposite peak. Others followed, and while they sported in this charming way, they laughed and sang, as only fairies can, and the young hunters' hearts leaped within them for joy at this awesome and wonderful sight. Suddenly, however, as with one mind, they caught up their bows, fitted the arrows to the strings, and the 10 shafts sped with unerring aim to as many diamond balls. The next moment a ball fell at each of the brothers' feet, but alas! the fairies had vanished, and the entrancing vision was seen no more. The young men picked up the balls and bestowed them safely in their knapsacks, sighing the while at the foolishness which had led them to sacrifice so delightful a sight. They lingered for a while in the hope that they might again behold it, but at last, very sad at heart, they turned away. Gradually the shadows lengthened in the forest aisles. Wild creatures crossed the hunters' path again and again, but the brothers paid heed to naught as they wandered moodily on. They thought only of the rash act which had deprived them of the entrancing vision, and the diamond ball which each had secured seemed but a poor substitute for the bewitching countenances of the fairy damsels. The young men were so deeply engaged in their bitter reflections that they failed to notice that they had come to the edge of the forest. Suddenly, however, an exclamation from one of the brothers caused them all to look up, and lo! before them was a castle like no fastness that mortal eye had ever seen. Its walls were mossy and rugged like those of the mountains around, but here and there were projecting casements, rounded in form, which sparkled and gleamed like the balls in the young men's knapsacks, and a great dome like a gigantic diamond surmounted the castle, and reflected the rays of the dying sun from 1,000,000 points. But more wonderful, and more grateful to the eyes of the brothers, was the vision of the fairy damsels whom they beheld gazing tenderly upon them from the outer walls. With a cry of joy the hunters flew to the great gates. They found them open and unguarded, and in less time than it takes to tell the story, the young men had clasped each a maiden in his arms. There is small need for words when heart speaks to heart, and all knew that they had met the desire of their souls. Together they now entered the castle, where they were met by a crowd of gorgeously attired servants, who invited the young men to refresh themselves after their toilsome march through the forest glades. They brought to them rich costumes befitting the sons of kings, robes embroidered with emeralds and pearls, and swords whose hilts and sheaths were studded with diamonds and rubies. The brothers were now conducted to the banqueting hall, where preparations had been made for a wedding feast, and the young men could hardly believe their good fortune when they learned that the lovely fairy maidens were to be their brides that very evening. You may be sure that they feasted and drank right merrily, and never was there such a wedding feast. Golden dishes glided upon the table as though moved by invisible hands. Plates and glasses were filled of themselves. It was only necessary to wish, and lo, the choicest viands and the most delicious wines were before them. Many happy days followed, in which the brothers forgot all else but the good fortune which had guided them to the castle. Their brides were as good as they were beautiful, and it would have been wonderful indeed had they remembered that envious time bestows few such blissful days upon even the most favoured. The fairy maidens were daughters of the Queen of the Stars, who had been absent in a distant part of her realm when the young hunters arrived before her castle. Tidings of what had taken place had now reached her, and in hot haste she descended upon a moonbeam and appeared before her daughters at the close of day. "Miserable children," she said, "what foolish deed have you committed? Know you not that fay and mortal may not mate, and that she who disobeys this law of fairyland must be for ever cast out of the happy companionship of the immortals?" At these threatening words the poor maidens pleaded tearfully with their mother that she should not drop their stars from the sky. But the Queen answered sorrowfully that she was powerless to save them from the fate which their disobedience had brought upon them. That same night the brothers one and all were visited by the self-same dream. In a vision of the night, the turul, that ill-omened bird of war, alighted upon each couch and croaked a call to battle which no hero may refuse to obey. The harsh sound was in their ears as they awoke on the morrow, and each told his wife sadly of the summons that called him away. The fairy maidens knew full well that never would they see their beloved husbands again, and very sad of heart were they as they bravely bade them good-bye, and watched them disappear into the forest, which had never before seemed so full of gloom. 7 days and 7 nights went by. The maidens could not rest for the terrible fear that was in their hearts. Never before had they known of fear, but now they tasted its bitterness, both for themselves and those whom they loved so fondly. At last, on the 7th night, they were wandering in the forest, for there was something in the stillness of the leafy aisles which eased their pain, when they beheld 10 stars fall from the sky. It was the death of their last lingering hopes. Their husbands had fallen in battle, and never more would they hear their loved voices or gaze upon their manly forms. The maidens wept so piteously that even the stars, which keep so cold a watch in the sky, were moved. But they did not all weep for the same cause. The 3 youngest thought only of the husbands whom they had lost forever, but their sisters grieved mostly for their own sad fate. At last, utterly exhausted, all alike sank into a quiet and restful sleep, and as they reclined upon the grassy bank where they had flung themselves in the first agony of grief, the Queen of the Stars came on a moonbeam, and gazed pityingly upon her children. Her heart was full as she beheld the pearly tears which told of the grief which even sleep could not banish, and silently she bestowed a tender kiss upon each loved face. Then she touched the maidens lightly with a magic wand, and instantly the sleeping forms were changed into bubbling springs. 7 were icy cold, but the streams which issued from the spots where the 3 youngest had lain were boiling hot. And to this day, if we go to where the Bûc and Matra meet, we may see the 10 springs, known to the peasants of that hill country as the 10 sisters, flowing to mingle their waters in the common stream, which rushes forever through the valley far beneath. End of chapter 1. Read by Kalynda in Lüneburg, Germany, on February 7th, 2009. Two of Folktales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalynda. Folktales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 2. Silence. This is a favorite story in many parts of Germany. Master Gaspar was the king's tailor, and high in favour with the nobility. Being an excellent workman, he had amassed a fortune, but though he had a fine house, ample means, and a handsome daughter who was admired by all, he was still unsatisfied. "If I had had a son," he sighed, "I should have brought him up to be a tailor like myself, and he would inherit my fortune. As it is, I have no one to succeed this fine business which I have built up by my own efforts." When he was weary of sighing for what fate had denied him, he invited his nephew John to become his apprentice and live in his house. Now John was already in love with Marie, whom he hoped one day to make his wife, so he gladly accepted his uncle's invitation. He was a good-natured young fellow, not particularly fond of work, but all would have gone well with him in his new home, had it not been for his ceaseless chatter, which distracted his companion's attention and made Master Gaspar justly angry. John was scolded, and Marie wept, but though the young man promised to mend his ways and work in silence, he soon forgot, and once more began to talk. This went on until Master Gaspar was out of patience and decided that they must part. "You must go," he said, "but it need not be forever unless you wish. Take a journey through France, and see if you cannot learn to conquer this foolish habit of yours. When you can show me 6 pieces of gold that you have earned by steady work, I will take you back into the business. More than this, you shall have my daughter for your wife, but not until you have proved that you deserve her." Marie's pretty face was sweet as a pink pea blossom in a shower of rain, as she blushed through her tears, and John wept with her, for he had a tender heart. As Master Gaspar refused to listen to their joint entreaties, there was nothing for John to do but to go, so he mournfully took his departure. Filled with regrets, he walked on, until his uncle's house was far behind him, and he reached the borders of a vast forest. A narrow pathway seemed to beckon to him, and still thinking of the weeping Marie, he strolled on listlessly beneath gnarled old oak trees, whose branches looked like the twisted limbs of tortured ogres. Needless to tell, he lost his way, and though he searched in every direction, he could see no trace of the path by which he had entered the forest. Dusk came on, and the trees grew dim and shadowy. The night birds called to each other sadly, and he heard in the distance the howling of hungry wolves. The sound filled him with dread, but in spite of his fears, he was soon overcome by weariness, and throwing himself at the foot of a tree, fell into a deep slumber. The night was half over when he awoke, and a ray of moonlight that shone through the boughs above showed a tiny dwarf standing close beside him. Without a word, the strange little creature took him by the hand and led him to the heart of the forest, where a bright wood fire lit up the darkness. 5 other dwarfs, no less curious to look at than the first, were grouped around the glowing embers, and with silent gestures invited John to join them. He sat down gratefully and warmed his hands. Still no one spoke, and after a while he ventured on a question. "Where am I?" he began, but could get no farther, for the nearest dwarf gave him such a slap in the face that his breath was taken away. Furious with anger, John leaped to his feet and would have flown at him, but at his first gesture the tiny dwarf instantly assumed the stature of a giant, and looked down so threateningly upon him that he feared to make another motion. As he did not stir, the wrath of the giant subsided, and he became a dwarf once more. Feeling much subdued, John sat down again, and did not open his lips for quite an hour. The forest was very still, the wind had dropped, and those of the wood folk who were not asleep moved so softly that they made no sound. The silence was intolerable to chattering John, and as a last resource he took out from his satchel his scissors, needles, and thread, in order to mend an ugly rent which a briar had torn in his spick-and-span coat. At the sight of these the dwarfs got up and danced with glee, showing him at the same time many rents in their own garments. Their joy emboldened John to speak once more. "Who are you?" he cried, "and why are your coats so torn?" The reply to his question was another blow, and again he was overwhelmed with impotent anger. He was 1 against 6, however, each of whom could transform himself at will into a mighty giant, so with unusual prudence he decided to hold his tongue. When the dwarfs had thrown more wood on the fire, so that it blazed up brightly, he threaded his finest needle and set to work on his coat. Immediately the eldest dwarf took off his own, and held it towards him entreatingly. John dared not refuse to do what he wanted, so he started at once to repair it. He worked away for a whole hour, and then, in spite of himself, burst out with another question. It met with the usual answer. His face ached all over with the slaps he had received, but he had no means of retaliation. "My uncle used to grumble if I chattered," he groaned to himself, "but these fellows reward me with frightful blows." As he did not know what else to do, he kept on stitching until the coat was neatly mended, when he handed it back to its owner without a word. The dwarf examined it with lively interest, and having no fault to find, took out of his pocket a gleaming piece of gold, which John, to his great delight, found was intended for himself. "Come," he thought cheerfully, "here's 1 piece of gold already. If I can earn the rest as quickly, I shall not have long to wait before I can claim dear Marie for my wife." By this time the night was almost spent. The birds were beginning to twitter drowsily, and the fire waned dull in the dawning light. With a sigh of relief, John put by his needles and thread, and was preparing to leave his strange companions, when one of them offered him a draught of wine, which he thankfully accepted. It tasted like fairy nectar, and he drained the silver cup to its very dregs. As he set it down, a wave of cold ran through his body, and he shivered like the leaves of an aspen when the wind blows up from a storm. In a few moments he had dwindled down to the size of the dwarfs themselves. His cry of alarm was met with another blow, and as he staggered to his feet, he felt with despair that resistance was useless. Making signs for him to follow them, the dwarfs led the way through the waking forest, and though shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy of leaves, and made ladders of gold on the soft green moss over which he trod, John could think of nothing but his sad fate and what was likely to happen next. The forest came to an end at last, and a huge black rock loomed before them like a giant's fortress. One of the dwarfs touched its jagged surface, a hidden door flew open silently, and John and his companions passed through it into a long, wide corridor. On both sides of this were tiny bedrooms, with furniture of mother-of-pearl and small white beds with hangings of rose-pink silk. Sounds of exquisite music were wafted from a distance, and John caught a glimpse of a brilliantly lighted ballroom at the far end of the corridor, filled with many dancers. He would have liked nothing better than to question his guides, but, wise at last, he resisted the inclination. After a moment's pause, they showed him into one of the bedrooms and pointed to the bed. He at once undressed and laid his head on the pillow. The music was now as soft as the lapping of waves on the seashore, and he fell asleep like a tired child. He woke in the twilight to find one of the dwarfs at the foot of his bed. The little fellow seemed impatient for him to rise, and when John opened his lips as if to speak, he raised his head so angrily that the youth deemed it advisable to keep his mouth shut. Dressing himself as quickly as he could, he followed the dwarf into the wide corridor, where the others joined them. All passed together out of the rock, and re-entered the forest as the last ray of light faded out of the sky. A fire was blazing under an arch of beeches, and once more John sat down and warmed himself. Not daring to speak, he thought it would be more agreeable to sew than to do nothing, so he again took out his needles and thread. At this another dwarf came forward with a torn coat, and John, while skilfully repairing it, made 2 attempts to speak. On each occasion he received one of the heavy blows he had learnt to dread, and for the rest of the night he uttered no word. Just before dawn the coat was finished, and on handing it back he was given a second piece of gold. Instead of rejoicing, he could only mourn. "What wretched luck that I should have been transformed into a dwarf!" he sighed, as he followed the little men back to the rock. "2 pieces of gold are mine already, and were it not for my misfortune, my uncle would give me Marie when I had earned 6." The wind in the trees re-echoed his sighs as it rustled among the falling leaves. The air was chill, and already the frosts of winter were turning the berries red. "That's curious," said John, to himself, you may be certain, for he knew better by this time than to speak out loud. "Yesterday was the 15th of October, yet to-day one might well think that it was mid-November." Again the rock opened at the dwarf's light touch, and they all went in as before. The same sweet music fell on John's ears, and the dancers still twisted and turned in the brilliantly lighted ballroom at the far end of the corridor. John spent the day in the little white bed with the rose silk hangings, and when once again he was roused by a dwarf, he dressed himself without risking a question. Only 3 dwarfs awaited them in the corridor, and on reaching the forest he was amazed to find that the ground was covered with snow. "How strange!" he thought. "It might be December, though only 3 days and nights have passed since I bade dear Marie farewell. Ah, how changed I am! Marie would not know me now, and even if she did, my uncle would never let her marry a dwarf. Why did I chatter so heedlessly, and play such tricks on my fellow apprentices? If I had held my tongue, I should never have come to this dreadful forest, to be struck and buffeted by stunted creatures who would not reach above my natural waist." A 3rd night passed in the same way as the rest, and only once did he forget himself and speak. The blow that followed made him sick with pain, but when overcome by anger he put down his work. The dwarfs looked so miserable that he took it up again and finished mending a 3rd coat. For this he was given a 3rd piece of gold, and once again the dwarfs returned to the rock. A 4th and a 5th night passed in exactly the same way, but on the 6th occasion only 1 dwarf accompanied him into the forest. The trees were still bare, but the cold was not so intense. Here and there in sheltered nooks the snowdrops were showing their dainty heads. By this time John felt rich, for 5 gold pieces jingled in his pockets. "Ah," he thought, as a rift in the trees above gave him a glimpse of the sky, the blue of which reminded him of Marie's eyes. "It seems to me as if it were months since the day I left her. If uncle could see my plight, he would be sorry for me." That night only the 1 dwarf sat with him by the fire. John worked on steadily at the last torn coat, for he had now quite lost the habit of chattering, and was as silent as Master Gaspar could have wished. As the 6th piece of gold was added to his store, he could scarcely restrain his tears as he thought how, but for his transformation, he might now claim Marie for his bride. The grateful dwarf offered him another cup of wine, but he shook his head, and then, to his great surprise, the little man, whom he had imagined to be dumb, began to speak. "Drink without fear, young man," he cried. "This wine will at once restore you to your former size." John seized the cup eagerly and emptied it at one draught. In a few moments he was as tall and as strong as when he had quitted his uncle's house, but although his joy was great, he did not dare express it audibly. "No doubt," the dwarf continued, looking at him kindly, "you would like to have some explanation of what you have seen. 100 years ago I and my 5 companions quarrelled in the king's ballroom, and flew at each other like angry wolves. Justly indignant at our folly, for quarrelling is not allowed in his domains, the king laid us under sentence of banishment, decreeing that we should spend the 15th night of each month in this dreary forest until a tailor came who could mend the garments we had torn. That we might learn to govern our unruly tongues, we were condemned neither to speak nor be spoken to, and the king declared that if we allowed any one to talk to us we should never return to our own homes. Year after year went by with no sign of a tailor, and we had lost all hope when we found you sleeping under a tree. Our hearts were filled with joy, for by the marks on your thumb and forefinger we guessed to what trade you belonged. But alas, you persisted in talking, and so we were obliged to stop you in the only way we could. Now that you have mended our coats, however, our troubles are at an end, and you can go back to your uncle's house. You will be surprised to find how long you have been away, for we made you sleep a month at a time. It was the 15th of October when you arrived, and now it is the 15th of March." The bridal songs of the blackbirds and thrushes were not more gay than the merry tune John hummed to himself as he hurried homeward. Marie greeted him with tender joy, and when in answer to the questions of Master Gaspar he proudly showed him his 6 gold pieces, he was at once allowed to take his old place in the workshop. Since he stitched most deftly, and in utter silence, his uncle was delighted, and there was nothing now to come between him and his heart's desire. His wedding with Marie was celebrated with much rejoicing, and no man ever had a fairer or sweeter bride. Years afterwards he would sometimes relate his adventures to his boys and girls as they sat around on the fire on frosty nights. "Ah, my dear children," he would say, "silence is an excellent thing. I learnt the lesson in a painful manner, but I have never regretted it. Chat away to your heart's content in your leisure moments, but when you work, work with all your might, and be sure to do it in silence." End of Chapter 2 of Folk Tales from Many Lands. Recording by Kalynda in Hamburg, Germany, on July 12th, 2008. Of Folk Tales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalynda. Folk Tales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 3. The Bell of Atri. A wise and just monarch was the good King John. His kingdom extended over central Italy, and included the famous town of Atri, which in days gone by had been a famous harbour on the shores of the Adriatic. Now the sea had retreated from it, and it lay inland. No longer the crested waves rolled on its borders, or tossed their showers of silver spray to meet the vivid turquoise of the sky. The great desire of good King John was that every man, woman, and child in his dominions should be able to obtain justice without delay, be they rich or poor. To this end, since he could not possibly listen to all himself, he hung a bell in one of the chief towns, and issued a proclamation to say that when this was rung a magistrate would immediately proceed to the public square and administer justice in his name. The plan worked admirably. Both rich and poor were satisfied, and since they knew that evil-doers would be quickly punished and wrongs set right, men hesitated to defraud or oppress their neighbours, and the great bell pealed less often as years went on. In the course of time, however, the bell rope wore thin, and some ingenious citizen fastened a wisp of hay to it, that this might serve as a handle. One day, in the height of summer, when the deserted square was blazing with sunlight, and most of the citizens were taking their noonday rest, their siesta was disturbed by the violent pealing of the bell. "Surely some great injustice has been done," they cried, shaking off their languor, and hastening to the square. To their amazement, they found it empty of all human beings save themselves. No angry supplicant appealed for justice, but a poor old horse, lame and half blind, with bones that nearly broke through his skin, was trying with pathetic eagerness to eat the wisp of hay. In struggling to do this he had rung the bell, and the judge, summoned so hastily for so light a cause, was stirred to indignation. "To whom does this wretched horse belong?" he shouted wrathfully. "What business has it here?" "Sir, he belongs to a rich nobleman, who lives in that splendid palace whose tall towers glisten white above the palm grove," said an old man, coming forward with a deep bow. "Time was that he bore his master to battle, carrying him dauntlessly amid shot and shell, and more than once saving his life by his courage and fleetness. When the horse became old and feeble, he was turned adrift, since his master had no further use for him, and now the poor creature picks up what food he can in highways and byways." On hearing this, the judge's face grew dark with anger. "Bring his master before me," he thundered, and when the amazed nobleman appeared, he questioned him more sternly than he would have done the meanest peasant. "Is it true," he demanded, "that you left this, your faithful servant, to starve, since he could no longer serve you? It is long since I have heard of such gross injustice. Are you not ashamed?" The nobleman hung his head in silence. He had no word to say in his own defence, as with scathing contempt the judge rebuked him, adding that in the future he would neglect the horse at his peril. "For the rest of his life," he said, "you shall care for the poor beast as he deserves, so that after his long term of faithful service he may end his days in peace." This decision was greeted with loud applause by the townfolk who gathered in the square. "Our bell is superior to all others," they said to each other with nods and smiles, "for it is the means of gaining justice not only for men, but for animals too in their time of need." And with shouts of triumph they led the old war horse back to his stable, knowing that for the future its miserly owner would not dare to begrudge it the comfort to which it was so justly entitled. End of Chapter 3 of Folktales from Many Lands. Recording by Kalynda in Hamburg, Germany, on July 12th, 2008. Of Folktales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Folktales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 4. Snow White. This is the Russian version of the myth of the Snow Maiden, so popular among all the nations of northern Europe. One fine winter's day, when the frost had spangled the dark green fir trees, and the ponds and rivers were thick with ice, Ivan and Maria, two Russian peasants, sat by their cottage window. They were looking wistfully at a group of merry children busily engaged in making a huge snowman. The little people were having a grand time, and though Ivan and Marie were both kind-hearted, the sight of their enjoyment made them very sad, for they had no children of their own, and their cottage was often lonely. "Fate has been unkind to us, wife," sighed Ivan, and Marie hid her face on his shoulder and tried to keep back her tears. After a while Ivan stopped sighing, and his wife lifted her head. "See how these young children yonder are enjoying themselves," he said. "Why shouldn't we follow their example? Let us go into the garden and build a snow woman." Marie smiled and agreed. They would be children again, she cried, and forget their trouble. The clear, dry air brought back the roses to her pale face, and her husband gave her a tender kiss as they passed behind a glistening fir tree. "Let us make a little snow child," she suggested, as Ivan began to shovel the crisp snow. "Ah, that's a very good idea!" exclaimed her husband, and soon he had shaped a little body with dainty hands and arms and feet. While he did this, his wife modelled a little head. It had such exquisite features that when it was fixed in its right place, both stepped aside to admire it. "It's lovely!" cried Ivan, and Marie sighed so deeply that the soft little curl she had given the little snow child seemed to stir on the pretty forehead. As Marie and her husband added some finishing touches, a stranger came down the road and inquired what they were doing. "We are making a snow child," replied Ivan, stepping back once more to admire the little figure. As he did so, he saw with intense surprise a gentle quiver of its eyelids. A soft pink colour stole into its cheeks and lips, and a deep sigh lifted the little bosom, and the dimpled fingers he had modelled so lovingly uncurled and stretched themselves. There stood before him a living child, a child more lovely than any that he or his wife had seen in their fairest dreams. "Who are you?" he asked, when he could speak, and his wife leant tremblingly against him, scarcely daring to breathe lest the entrancing vision of the child should vanish from her sight. "I am Snow White, your little daughter," replied the figure, throwing her fairy-like arms around his neck as he bent towards her. Marie, in turn, received a sweet embrace, and, weeping for joy, they quickly took her into the cottage. No longer now were Yvon and Marie lonely. Snow White prattled to them by the hour together, and they were never weary of watching her. Her tiny feet pattered over the snow like those of some small white elf, and the colder it was, the happier she seemed to be. Her favourite playthings were the glittering icicles that hung from the frosted trees. Snow White's hair was like fine spun silk, her eyes were blue as the heavens, and her skin white as snow. So gentle and sweet were her looks and ways that every one loved her dearly, and the children in the village were never so happy as when they played with her. The winter passed and the snow melted. Before the spring sunshine had spread a wave of green over the land and studded the meadows with brilliant flowers, Snow White had grown as tall as a girl of 12. As the days grew longer, she lost her joyous spirits, and became quiet and sad. "Are you ill, my child?" inquired her mother, but Snow White shook her head. "No, dear mother, I am not ill," she murmured, but instead of playing with the other children, as she had loved to do before, she stayed indoors, gazing out of the window with dreamy eyes, as if she saw what was not visible to mortal eyes. "Snow White! Snow White! What are you doing?" cried a group of her small companions, peeping in through the window. "Come with us, we are going to the woods to gather flowers, and dance round the fairy ring." "Yes, go to the woods with your little friends, my darling," said her mother fondly, tying a ribbon over her pale gold curls, that they might not be ruffled by the wind. Snow White left the cottage reluctantly. She would far rather have stayed home, and her steps were the only listless ones in that merry throng. When the children had filled their laps with many-hued blossoms, they wove them into wreaths and crowns, for that night they were going to have a festival, and they wanted to look like queens. As the day wore on, they returned to their homes, but when dusk had fallen, they came back for Snow White, and once more she went with them. Her soft blue eyes were very wistful as she glanced at her father and mother, but they bade her go and play. There was a bonfire in the market-place, and the dancing flames leapt high. The sparks flew round in gleaming showers, and the children laughed and shouted. "Look at us, Snow White, and do as we do," said first one and then another, jumping over the fire. Suddenly they saw that Snow White had vanished. "Where are you?" they cried, but there was no reply. Snow White had melted in the heat of the fire, and floated away as vapour to the clouds from which she had first come, in soft white flakes of snow. Her friends and playmates searched for her unavailingly, and never again did she sit with her parents by their cottage door. End of Chapter 4 of Folktales from Many Lands. Recording by Kalynda in Hamburg, Germany, on July 12, 2008. Of Folktales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalynda. Folktales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 5 Godfrey the Little Hermit. Godfrey's father was very poor, for though he worked hard the summer through, tending the fields of his richer neighbours, and since he lived by the seashore, mended the fishermen's nets for them when it was too cold to go a-fishing, it was only by the thrift and good management of his wife that the big family in the little cottage had enough to eat. Godfrey helped his father to work in their own garden, where they grew fruit and vegetables, and many a golden marrow or sweet potato reached their frugal table as the result of his industry. The boy was bright and intelligent, but he liked play better than work, and his father was touched when he noticed that Godfrey's affection for himself and his mother had overcome his distaste for drudgery. "You have pleased me greatly this last week, my son," he said one day, "and I am going to give you some pleasure in return. If tomorrow be fine, I will take you to the Green Island where my father lived in days gone by." Godfrey had often longed to visit this green island, which on a clear day he could see from the shelving beach, where he loved to play with his small brothers and sisters. He had often heard his father speak of the walnut trees that grew there, and the drooping willows which would give them such a good supply of cane for making their baskets. He was, therefore, delighted at the suggestion, and could scarcely sleep that night for excitement. Very early next morning, when the sky was still pink with dawn clouds, he was up and astir. A faint grey haze over the distant hills gave a hint of rain, but as the sun rose high in the heavens, this melted into the blue, and his fears of a storm as quickly vanished. The moment breakfast was over, he would have started full speed for the boat, but his father would not allow. "Gently, my boy," the good man cried, "you have several things to carry." As he spoke, he pointed out a long, thick winter cloak, various stores of bread and meat, 2 choppers, a big iron pot, a coil of rope, and 2 large baskets. Godfrey looked at them in dismay. "Why, father," he cried, "what do you want with all of these things? The day is too warm for your winter cloak, and as for the food, 1 loaf and half that meat would be sufficient." His father smiled indulgently. "It is well to be prepared for all things, my son," he remarked. "Last time I was on the island a storm blew up, and I was glad enough of my thick cloak to shelter me during the night, for I had to remain there until morning." And in spite of Godfrey's conviction that his father was making too much of a danger unlikely to happen, each article was carefully carried down to the boat. The sea was very calm. Godfrey and his father each took an oar, and soon their little cottage became but a tiny speck in the distance, while the green island grew larger and larger, until at last Godfrey could see the splendid grove of walnut trees which gave it its emerald hue. Springing on to the shore, he made the boat fast with the rope, and though Godfrey would have preferred to start nutting at once, his father said he must wait for this until they had cut a good supply of willows. It was hot work, even with their sharp choppers, and when dinner time came, the sun was high in the sky. Godfrey brought the iron pot from the boat, and his father showed him how to set light to the heap of dry wood they had collected by rubbing 2 sticks together until these became so hot that they burst into flame. When this was accomplished, the iron pot was slung over the centre by means of 2 boughs, and a portion of the meat was quickly cooked. Godfrey had never enjoyed a meal so much before, and when it was finished his thoughts flew off to the walnuts. "Not so fast, my son," his father said, as the boy picked up the baskets. "These things must first be taken back to the boat." Godfrey obeyed unwillingly, but not until all had been replaced was he permitted to go to the walnut groves. Once there, he quickly forgot his vexation. His father climbed high up in the trees, and as he shook the branches there fell a shower of fine, ripe nuts. Time after time Godfrey refilled the baskets, emptying them when they threatened to overflow into the stern of the boat. "We shall have a splendid supply for the winter," they said to each other as they worked away, too happily occupied to notice the clouds that were gathering overhead. These drifted at first in 2s and 3s, then they gathered together in huge battalions until the sun was hidden, and the seagulls flew low over the waves, uttering strange, shrill cries. Godfrey happened to be in the boat, emptying his baskets for the 4th time, when his attention was suddenly aroused by a big wave, which dashed it from its moorings so violently that the rope gave way. "Father, father!" he cried, but amidst the roar of the sea his voice was lost, and though he did his best to steady the boat with a heavy oar, it was swiftly carried away from the land on the strong current. Not until he was beyond help did his father come down to the shore. The boat was carried swiftly on, tossed from side to side by big green waves, which, try as they would, could not overturn it. Stricken with terror, Godfrey crouched at the bottom, and when at length the motion of the sea grew calmer, and the rain ceased to beat on his shrinking form, he could scarcely believe that the storm was over. A little while later, and the keel of the boat struck on a rock. The planks shivered, but did not break, and he was thrown out upon dry land. When the first shock was over, he sat up tremblingly and looked about him. Greatly to his surprise, for he had often heard his father say that the Green Island was the only one on that coast, he found himself upon a plateau of land. Wherever he looked there was nothing but rocks and sea and sky, and the scene was so desolate in its loneliness that he burst into tears. "What shall I do?" he cried, gazing wildly around him. The doleful call of the seagulls were his only answer, and wrapping himself in his father's coat, he sobbed himself to sleep. When he awoke it was morning, and the troubled sea of the night before was a sheet of golden ripples. With renewed courage he made a meal on some of the bread and meat which had escaped a wetting, and as he did so he remembered how, but for his father's insistence the day before, he would now have no food at all. As he was very thirsty, he started to explore the little island, hoping to find some stream or spring, but for long he searched in vain. His throat was parched and dry, and his lips burning, when he heard the murmur of trickling water. Following this, he came to a deep ravine, at the bottom of which ran a little stream. How thankful he felt as he slaked his thirst and bathed his face in its sparkling shallows. When he had rested a little, he climbed a hill from whence he could see a long way round him. But though the white sails of several vessels were clearly visible against the distant coastline of the green island, his frantic signals failed to reach them, and they soon passed out of sight. Godfrey supped that night on bread and nuts, and then, wrapping himself once more in the big cloak, said his prayers and fell asleep. Meanwhile his parents suffered agonies of distress. His mother watched all through the night, and when morning came without any sign of her dear one's return, she hastened to implore the help of a rich neighbour. "Do not weep," he said to her very kindly. "Most likely their boat has been carried away by the storm, and they are in safe shelter. I will seek them at once." Without a moment's delay he started for the green island in his fine new sailing vessel, and before long Godfrey's parents were weeping in each other's arms. When the mother heard what had happened to her boy, she was almost broken-hearted, and his brothers and sisters were overwhelmed with grief. "We shall never see him again," they sobbed, and little Elsa, who loved him best of all, no longer sang when she played with her dolls or helped her mother put the little ones to bed. As the days went on, and no one came to his rescue, Godfrey began to realize that if he wished to live he must bestir himself. The stock of food that he had brought with him in his boat was soon exhausted, and since it was only in the crevices of the rocks that plants could grow on that island, he found few berries to satisfy his hunger. The sight of fish in deep pools left by the tide naturally suggested that he should catch them. The pretty green ribbon that Elsa had pinned round his hat the morning he left home made an excellent line, with a pin at one end and a rod of willow at the other. After a long search he found a worm, and casting the rod into a pool, he soon hooked a fish. This he cooked in the iron pot, over a fire of dried moss. "What a good thing," he thought, "that father made me carry all these things down to the boat. If I had left them under the tree when we had finished our meal, what should I have done now? Father was quite right. Order is a very good thing." Godfrey did not stop at catching the small fish in the pools. With the help of a sharp-pointed stone he made a larger hook, and so caught big ones. He found a little salt, too, in a chink in the rocks, and this greatly improved their flavour. Mussels and limpets were now added to his usual fare, and when he discovered some eatable seaweed he felt that he was fortunate indeed. The summer days slipped quickly by, and the stars smiled down on him through their friendly darkness in the dusk of the evening. Although alone, he was not frightened until once more a heavy storm broke over the island, drenching his cloak with rain and making fishing impossible. He felt cold and wet, and very miserable, as he wondered what would happen to him when winter came. "It will soon be here," he sighed. "It is autumn now, and the nights are getting colder. I must find a cave, or I shall be frozen to death." It was not easy to do this, but at last he discovered a snug little shelter behind some bushes, and very close to the stream at which he slaked his thirst. He collected a big heap of moss, and took it inside to serve him as a bed. Opposite this he placed his precious chopper and iron pot, and the few planks which were all that now remained of his father's boat. His next task was to chip a deep hole in a rock close by, so that he might fill this with water, and use it as a little reservoir in which to keep a supply of fish. Some of the planks he cut up for firewood, and the rest formed the roof of the stone kitchen he built between two rocks, since it was impossible for him to have a fire inside the cave on account of the smoke. As time went on, he thought of many other contrivances for his comfort, and became quite skilled in fashioning tools from the rough materials at his command, using his chopper as a hammer, and a large stone as an anvil. Before long he had quite a brave show of fishing tackle, and if once the sea had been cruel to him, he found it was now his kindest friend. It provided him with sufficient food to keep him alive through the dreary winter, and although he often went hungry to bed, when spring came he was strong and well, and the eggs of the sea birds that built their nests on the island soon afforded him a pleasant change from so much fish. As the days grew longer, and white sails crossed and recrossed the calm blue waters, he hoped once more that someone might see his signals, but all in vain. His poor little flag fluttered sadly in the breeze, for the distant sailors, if they saw it at all, thought it only some homing sea bird on the wing. One evening, when the wind blew high, and the waves that dashed on the rocky island threw up great clouds of spray, the sound of most exquisite singing broke upon his ears. It seemed to come from a little bay where the waters were always calm. He hurried towards this, full of wonder, and there, on the edge of a steep black rock, he fancied he saw the most lovely mermaid, her white neck decked with ropes of pearls, and her glistening form half hidden in a veil of red gold hair. She held out her arms to him entreatingly. "Come to me, come," she chanted, "and the treasures of the deep shall be yours forever. Hunger and thirst shall trouble you no more, and your sleep shall be sweet and dreamless." Godfrey would have flown to her embrace, for her voice was sweeter than the song of birds, but there flashed across his memory the warning, "Beware of merfolk," that he had once heard from his mother's lips. So he shook his head and resolutely turned away. The dulcet tones of the mermaid's voice changed to a shriek of anger, and tearing asunder her necklace of gleaming pearls, she plunged into the sea. All that night through he dreamt of the scattered gems. "If I could find them," he thought wistfully, as he made his way down to the shore, "my father would be rich." Then he remembered that it was very unlikely that he would ever see his father and mother again, and when he reached the bay, his eyes were filled with tears. No mermaid sang there now, and he could find no pearls, but the sea had tossed up delicate branches of pink and red coral, and many shells. After a while he noticed a bed of oysters at the foot of the rock, and taking some of these back to the cave with him, he made a delicious breakfast. To his great delight he found inside each oyster shell an exquisite round pearl, and he placed these with the coral in a little bag he had woven out of coarse grasses to while away the time. Day by day, as he ate more oysters, he added to his shining store, and it saddened him to think that he could not send them home. "I wish that the seagulls would carry them, if I may not go myself," he sighed. But the seagulls flew over his head in happy unconcern of all his troubles, and the night wind whispered patience. Godfrey had been on the island now for a whole year. His clothes were quite worn out, and but for the big winter cloak that had been his father's he would have had nothing to wear. With much ingenuity he cut it into a long coat, and when he had donned it he looked so like a monk or an old hermit that he laughed as he saw himself mirrored in the stream. That summer he was never idle, storing up moss and driftwood for fuel, and drying fish in the hot sun for winter use. He was very lonely, but the wind told him tales of far-off lands, and the summer breezes told him to hope on still. "Something will happen soon," they murmured, and Godfrey tried to believe them. One morning he set off early to collect driftwood, for the tide had been high the night before, and the beach was strewn with the wreckage of a great ship that had gone down far away. He had left a small fire burning in his little kitchen, and on his return he was horrified to see that the wind had blown it into a great one, and that his flames had caught the wooden ceiling. His stock of fuel and fishing tackle were also burned fiercely. Even his table and bench had not been spared, and when he saw that he would have nothing left, He fell on his knees in utter despair. "I must die now," he sobbed. "The winter is coming, and I shall have neither food nor warmth, since I cannot fish without my tackle, and my fuel has all gone." And though the sun streamed down on him very kindly, and a soft little breeze tried to tell him that all was not yet lost, he would not be comforted. Now it happened that on that very morning it had come into his father's head to visit the Green Island. His stock of willows was at an end, and despite his wife's forebodings, he set off with 2 of the children, promising faithfully that neither of them should get into the boat without him. The poor woman watched him pull off sorrowfully. She was thinking of Godfrey, whom she never expected to see again, and her tears fell fast as she went about her work. The little party reached the island safely, and while the father busied himself in cutting willows, the children played on the shore. When his task was done, they begged him to take them up the hill that they might catch a glimpse of their cottage. "How small it looks!" cried little Elsa, as they gazed far over the sea. "Look yonder, father," she added presently. "Isn't that a wreath of smoke?" "Yes," he replied. "Very likely it is a ship on fire." "I think it is a volcano," said his small son, who had been reading about one in school. But his father did not heed him. "It's very curious," he said, "but I fancy I can see 2 hills. If so, that must be another island. I never heard of it before." "If it's an island," cried Elsa, "perhaps it is inhabited, and Godfrey may be there." The father had just had the same thought, and it made him tremble. "It is possible," he said. "Let us go back as quickly as we can, and I will speak to our neighbour. He is a kind man, and will lend me his sailing boat." When they reached home, their mother was told what they had seen, and her heart beat with a new hope. The neighbour consented gladly to lend his boat. "To-morrow," he said to Godfrey's father, "if the weather is favourable, we will go, and perhaps neighbour John will accompany us." The men set off early the following morning, but when they reached the plateau of rocks where Godfrey had found a refuge, they saw no signs of any dwelling, nor of a human being. "It is an uninhabited island," neighbour John said sadly. "Let us explore it carefully," cried Godfrey's father. "Perhaps we shall discover something that once belonged to my poor boy." Suddenly they caught sight of a slender figure in a long garment, and took it to be that of a monk. As they hastened towards it with eager questions, the figure turned, and sprang into the father's arms with a cry of joy. It was no monk he found, but Godfrey himself. By this time the sun was setting, and the sea was a field of gold. As they sat together in the peaceful twilight, for they could not leave the island until dawn, Godfrey told his rescuers how he had contrived to live through the long winter, and of his despair when the fire had destroyed his few possessions. "I thought I was quite forsaken," he said, and his father drew him yet closer to his side. "No, my son," he told him gravely, "you were not forsaken. It was the smoke from that fire that made me think there was an island here, and but for this we should never have come to save you." No words can describe his mother's joy when Godfrey was restored to her, and his brothers and sisters would hardly let him out of their sight. The kindly neighbour made a feast for him, and his friends gathered round from far and near to listen to the story of his adventures. The courage and perseverance that he had shown under such great difficulties made them look upon him as a little hero, and what pleased him most was the fact that his father would be poor no longer, for the pearls and corals in Godfrey's little bag fetched so large a sum that he and his wife lived in comfort for the rest of their days, and were able to give their children a good education, which they could not do before. Godfrey was taught many things at school, but the lessons of patience and trust and perseverance which he had learned on that lonely island were more precious to him than all. End of Chapter 5 of Folktales from Many Lands. Recording by Kalynda in Hamburg, Germany on July 12, 2008. Of Folktales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalynda. Folktales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 6. The Two Gifts. A heavy snowstorm was raging, and great soft flakes fell through the air like feathers shaken from the wings of an innumerable host of angels. By the side of the roadway sat a poor old woman, her scanty clothing affording but poor protection from the icy blast of the wind. She was very hungry, for she had tasted no food that day, but her faded eyes were calm and patient, telling of an unwavering trust in Providence. Perhaps, she thought, some traveller might come that way who would take compassion on her and give her alms. Then she could return to the garret that she called home, with bread to eat, and fuel to kindle a fire. The day drew in, and still she sat and waited. At last a traveller approached. The thick snow muffled every sound, and she was not aware of his coming until his burly figure loomed before her. Her plaintive voice made him turn with a start. "Poor woman," he cried, pausing to look at her very pityingly, "it is hard for you to be out in such weather as this." Then he passed on without giving her anything. His conscience told him that he ought to have relieved her, but he did not feel inclined to take off his thick glove in that bitter cold, and without doing this he could not have found a coin. The poor woman was naturally disappointed, but she was grateful for his kind words. By and by another traveller appeared. This one was driving in a splendid carriage, warmly wrapped in a great fur cloak. As he caught sight of the poor creature by the roadside, he felt vaguely touched by the contrast of his own comfort with her misery. Obeying a sudden impulse, with one hand he let down the carriage window, and he signed to his coachman to stop, and with the other felt in his pocket. The poor old woman hurried up to the carriage, a thrill of hope bringing a tinge of colour to her pale and withered cheeks. "How terribly cold it is!" exclaimed the rich man, and as he took his hand from his pocket and held out a coin to her, he noticed that instead of silver he was about to give her a piece of gold. "Dear me, that is far too much!" he cried, but before he could return it to his pocket, the coin slipped through his fingers and fell in the snow. A rough blast of wind made his teeth chatter, and pulling up the window in a great hurry, with a little shiver he drew the fur rug closely around him. "It certainly was too much," he murmured philosophically as the carriage rolled on, "but then I am very rich, and can afford to do a generous action now and then." When his comfortable dinner was over, and he was sitting in front of a blazing fire, he thought once more of the poor old woman. "It is not nearly so cold as I thought," he remarked, as he settled himself more comfortably in his deep armchair. "I certainly gave that old creature too much. However, what's done is done, and I hope she will make good use of it. I was generous, very generous indeed, and no doubt God will reward me." Meanwhile, the other traveller had also reached his journey's end, and he too had found a blazing fire and a good dinner waiting for him. He could not enjoy it, however, for he was haunted by the remembrance of that bent and shrunken figure in the waste of snow, and felt very remorseful for not having stopped to help her. At last he could bear it no longer. "Bring another plate," he said, calling the servant to him. "There will be two to dine instead of one. I shall be back soon." Saying this, he hurried through the darkness to the spot where he had left the old woman. She was still there, feebly searching amongst the snow. "What are you looking for?" he asked. "I am trying to find a piece of money which a gentleman threw me from his carriage window," she told him falteringly, scarcely able to speak from cold and hunger. It was no wonder, he thought, that she had not found it, for her hands were numbed and half frozen, and she was not only old, but nearly blind. "I am afraid you will never find it now," he said. "But come with me," he added consolingly. "I will take you to my inn, where there is a bright fire and a good dinner waiting for both of us. You shall be my guest, and I will see that you have a comfortable night's lodging." The poor old woman could scarcely believe her good fortune, as she tremblingly prepared to follow her new friend. Noticing that she was lame as well as nearly blind, he took her arm, and with slow and patient steps led her to the hotel. When the recording angel wrote that night in the book of heaven, he made no mention of the piece of gold which the wealthy traveller had given by mistake, for only a worthy motive gains credit in that book. But amidst the good deeds that had been wrought that day, he gave a foremost place to that of the man who had repented of his hardness, and faced once more the bitter cold, that he might share his comforts with a fellow creature so much less fortunate than himself. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7 of Folktales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalynda. Folktales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 7. Better Than That. Joseph was one of Austria's greatest emperors, and many trembled at his frown. The monarchs of other lands paid court to him, and he was the envied of all. But he often grew weary of the cares of state, and longed for a more simple life than he could live in his palace. His greatest pleasure at such times was to leave his nobles and wander unattended, so plainly dressed that he might have been one of his poorer subjects, through the streets of his grand capital. Sometimes he would go for a ramble in the surrounding country, finding in the company of the wood-folk and the rustling of the forest leaves far more delight than in the gorgeous functions at the palace. One Sunday in autumn, when the trees had donned their richest garb of red and orange, he determined to go for a long drive, and taking an unpretentious buggy and one of the fleetest horses in his stable, he set off by himself. Though the sky had been cloudless when he started, and the people he met were dressed in their best, as if bad weather were out of the question, the wind blew up from the rainy quarter, and before long a sharp shower made him raise the hood of his buggy. The citizens now were hurrying to shelter, and he too thought it well to return. He had not driven far upon the homeward road when a soldier accosted him, little guessing to whom he spoke. "I beg your pardon, sir," he said, "but I thought that perhaps you would give me a lift, as I should not inconvenience you. My uniform is a new one, and I don't want it to get spoilt." He was a fine, handsome young fellow, with a frank and open face. The Emperor was much taken by his appearance, and invited him to jump in. In a few minutes they were chatting together as if they had been well acquainted, and the soldier treated his new friend to a glowing account of a pleasant day he had lately spent with an old comrade. "He gave me a famous dinner, I can tell you," he concluded, and the Emperor, much amused, inquired of what this had consisted. "Guess!" cried the soldier, chuckling with delight at the recollection of the feast. "Cabbage soup, perhaps?" questioned his Majesty with an indulgent smile. "Soup, indeed!" the soldier exclaimed with much contempt. "Better than that. You must guess again." "A calf's head, then?" said the Emperor. "Better than that, even," was the laughing answer, and the same reply was given when the Emperor suggested a big slice of ham. "Much better than that!" cried the soldier triumphantly. "I had a roast pheasant, and one that I shot myself on his Majesty's estate, for my friend is now one of the Emperor's gamekeepers. It was delicious, and no mistake." His companion made no reply, but the soldier chatted away quite at his ease, telling him of the aged parents who were so proud of him, and the dear little Greta, who would one day become his wife. "Where do you live?" inquired his Majesty as they neared the city. "The rain has ceased, but I should like to drive you home." Much gratified by this further kindness, the soldier thanked him warmly, and begged that he would tell him his name. "Ah, it is your turn to guess now," remarked the Emperor. "Who do you think I am?" "Perhaps you also have something to do with the army?" hazarded the soldier with a searching look. The Emperor nodded. "You are a private soldier?" was the next guess. "Better than that," the Emperor smilingly returned. "A lieutenant, then?" "Better than that." "A colonel?" stammered the soldier, beginning to feel alarmed. "Better than that, I assure you." "Perhaps, then, you are a general?" the man said timidly, and then in desperation, as the Emperor shook his head, he suggested, "A field marshal?" "Better than that," said the Emperor once more, and the soldier turned pale with terror. "Then you must be his Majesty himself!" he gasped, and would have sprung from the buggy if the Emperor had not prevented him. "We will keep to our bargain," he said, and insisted upon driving him right up to his home. On the way he gave the young man some good advice that he never forgot, and ended by saying, with a kindly twinkle in his deep-set eyes, "And be careful in future not to kill pheasants before first obtaining the owner's permission, or to tell tales of your friends to the first stranger who comes your way." End of chapter 7. Of Folktales from Many Lands. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kalynda. Folktales from Many Lands by Lilian Gask. Chapter 8. Aicha's Stratagem. This is a very popular story with the Arabs. The town of Tlemcen in Algeria was under siege, and its ill-starred inhabitants were now on the point of starvation. Daily provisions became more scarce,